If you'd like to start gathering around, we're going to start the talks soon. Cool. Please gather around in silence. Yeah, right at the front, do it. Welcome everyone. Time that right in time for a chair to scrape across the floor. Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know it's very cold. I'm feeling it in particular because I just got back from Australia, so bit of a contrast. But yeah, I'm really excited about this. This is design systems is something that I'm really passionate about. I've been working on for a couple of years, and it's really nice to see that there's lots of other people that are enthusiastic and excited about it too. I'm really grateful to XO Group for hosting this today, and particularly to Sylvia for helping get this all set up. She made it really easy, so thank you very much. We're going to have, as it said on the description, we're going to have 3 speakers tonight. Sylvia and Phil from XO Group, Emily from BuzzFeed, and myself. In future meetups, I hope not to speak and have lots more other people speak. And if you're interested in hosting a meetup or interested in speaking at one, please reach out. I have like a ton of ideas of topics that I think we could talk about, and I'm sure lots of you do as well. So thanks for coming. Without further ado, we're going to listen to Sylvia and Phil from XO Group, and we're going to try and keep the talks to about 10 minutes, and then we're going to do questions at the end. Thank you.
Obligatory technical setup.
That is line chat from Saga, if anybody's listening here. What was the shortcut?
Command Shift.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for making it out and being here with us. We're excited to kick off the night and to share with you where we are in our design system development. So let's start with the show of hands. Who here knows XO Group? That was actually more than expected. Who knows the knot? All right, more. So Phil and I both work for the Knot, and the XO Group is our parent company. So this is our obligatory marketing slide. Through XO Group's family of brands, the Knot, the Nest, and the Bump, we inspire, inform, and cheer on our community as they move through life's most amazing and stressful milestones. From the proposal to creating a home to starting a family together, we're there for every step of the journey.
So we work on the Knot's website, and this is what the current design system looks like. This is the Knot UI pattern library. It was built in tandem with our site relaunch in 2014. Documentation is built with hologram, and there's a lot of good stuff in it. I mean, some companies don't have any style guides at all, so I'm thankful that we have something. However, it's become monolithic, difficult to contribute to. It also has, as you can see, there's styles that aren't really general purpose, which just kind of adds to the overall bloat of it.
So we treated our pattern library as a project and not a product. So there was no dedicated support and nobody there to iterate on it. It pretty quickly turned into a zombie and started contributing to a disjointed site experience. A lot of teams didn't want to use it, so it created many, many one-offs. So this is where Union comes in. The whole point of Union is about realigning our products to provide a unified experience that delivers an expert, personalized, and joyful journey for our couples. So the part that we're focusing on is creating a consistent design language and documenting it through a live style guide. So how do we develop this from a user-centric place? We know that the way you build great products is by doing it together. So with our users being developers, designers, and product, we used a few different design methodologies to drive out the features that our new product needs. Like surveys, we felt that we asked our users how they currently felt about patterns and what specifically they cared about. So overwhelmingly, it was too many dependencies, slowness, and documentation. We could brute force our way through documentation, but if we solve the first two well, then documentation should come naturally. We developed personas and empathy maps to identify pain points and user motivations. And then for good measure, we also did scenario mapping. This served to document specific tasks that we were already pretty familiar with carrying out. And it also served to shake out any comments, ideas, or suggestions that we had. We were already well acquainted with some of the pain points of patterns because we were required to use patterns, but this really gave us the chance to consider all user needs.
So our team is made up of designers and developers. Following the augmented federated version, that really kind of made sense for us here at XO. So some of you might be familiar with this. We got this idea from the Salesforce UX article that's linked on the bottom there. And this illustration is from Nathan Curtis's article that's shared on that first one. So we have weekly meetings. We currently have 10 members who have committed to put part of their 10% time towards this effort. They all are on their own teams. They have their own KPIs. So, they have a kind of the regular work, but, to make this successful, it's important to get representation from all the various teams that are, contributing to the knot.com. And we're calling this group the Federation. Nerdy Star Trek reference if you want. Otherwise, it's just references a federated team.
So like Phil said, we don't have designer/developer, so it was really important to kick off this product together. So we kicked it off with a component cut-up workshop. This is also an exercise from Nathan Curtis that we highly recommend. We got a group of designers and developers together, and basically we printed out the entire site and cut it up into components that worked for us. There was an organization and a naming part of it, and that definitely got a lot easier with booze. Then came Airtable. So once we had all of our components, we ported that into Airtable, this wonderful tool for pretty light database management, and started influenced by Dan Mall's article linked at the bottom there. And we loved his approach about thinking of content separate from the way it's displayed. So we also had to tackle how to version our GUI kit, since populating the style guide would be such a collaborative process between design and development that we needed better versioning than the system we had of just putting files on the server. So we now use a combination of Git and Folio, which makes it really easy for designers and for product people who aren't very familiar with Git, and they can still contribute.
So let's talk about documentation. So we're using the static site generator Jekyll along with GitHub pages to create our docs. And this makes it really easy to work on and publish changes. You don't need to jump through the typical hoops to get something up on production. It's really easy and simple. At that URL right there, we currently have really just the skeleton of the guide, as we're kind of in the beginning of this this journey. But it's right there if you want to check it out, exogroup.github.io/union. So we've discussed managing SaaS dependencies a lot, and we decided to manage them with NPM. Various components could depend on a specific version of a package, for example, like buttons or typography. That way, you know, the versioning can be managed with your, however you're bundling those together. We're also exploring the monolithic repo option that's currently being talked about a lot, similar to the structure of React components in Ant design, if you've checked that out at all. That came up just earlier this week. So right now we're kind of weighing the pros and cons of both approaches, try to figure out what's going to make the most sense for us.
So what's next for us? Lots of things. We're at the beginning stages of a product that we hope to build out and that everybody will know and love. So we still need to work on our foundational component design and how to work that into our display pattern design. We're testing our documentation design, and then also just constantly checking that our process is working for us. This is a new team, a new process that we're trying for the company. So we really want everybody's input to just constantly improve. So we would love for you to follow our journey. We have lots more to go, but we love engaging with the design systems community to bounce around ideas. Thank you.
So next up, loud cheers. Next up we have Emily, from BuzzFeed. So while she's setting up, I'll just talk a little bit about her. So she's a product designer who's been working at BuzzFeed for the last 2 years and contributes to their CSS framework, Solid. She wrote a great Medium article about it, so if you want to find out more, I recommend checking that out. That's how I heard about her. And she also works on the product as well. And now she's going to talk about how they started and where they got up to when she types in the numbers. Cool. Yay. All right. Thanks, Diana. Hello. Like Diana said, I'm Emily. I work at BuzzFeed as a product designer, where I've been for a little over 2 years now. And at BuzzFeed, I work on mainly the consumer-facing website and also our style guide, Solid. Yeah, Solid is a lightweight CSS framework. Originally built for our digital products, we've since kind of branched out to make the framework open to the public and free for anyone to kind of use and play with, as well as open source the code. Couldn't find a GIF for this slide. I'm sorry, guys. Before BuzzFeed, I was a coding cowgirl. No, not really. I was a front-end designer working for a 3D printing marketplace called Shapeways. And there I was kind of able to see the benefits of really working in the code and kind of seeing a product, seeing a design through from design conception to execution. And also seeing the benefits of like really working closely with engineers. So when I got to BuzzFeed, it was definitely very different. I think one main difference that I saw was that the designers weren't super involved with how their designs were being built. They were using tools like Zeppelin and InVision. I don't know if you guys have heard of these, but basically they would perfect their mocks into these like very perfect static specs. And then they would send these specs off to engineers to kind of like ease the handoff process. So this presented a couple problems right from the start. I think the first problem was while they were handing off these like pixel perfect mocks, they actually weren't perfect. All of the numbers here are kind of random and made up and not based off any kind of system. Another problem was that it was very slow. So designers would like send their specs off, hear back a few weeks later, really only to find that they had left a few key pieces out of the design because the static mock couldn't totally encompass what they were trying to do and the engineer couldn't read their mind. Seems like a very obvious, simple thing, but like I think it does get missed quite a bit. So I went and got my dev environment set up anyway. I was like, I'm just going to check this out and see what's going on. And I found out that we were building a component library, or the engineers were.
And this component library was based off of the existing website modules. So everything here was like it already existed on the website. They were just turning them into these like tight little components. This seemed okay, like I got it. It's a way to reduce duplication. You know, this was like the pitch, no more code bloat, super great, right? Having a library of styles to reference and having, you know, being able to reduce the number of styles for the same UI makes like total sense. But there were a couple of things that didn't make sense. So one, the engineering team was working on this with like 0 input from design, which is crazy. How did they know which things to componentize? Like, how did they know which UI designs are here to stay? How did they know which things should be modified? The second was that the library itself wasn't really holding up to its promises, especially in terms of like code blow. So this is an example of an early component. This is what we call a story block. It makes up our feeds. And since feeds are a huge part of our system at BuzzFeed, it made sense to make this a component. So the styles of the story block were appended to the component using a pretty common BEM class structure. And depending on the parameters, story blocks could or could not involve like any of the above things, like a title, an image, metadata, etc. Super flexible, right? Except not really. So while the style of the story block was very standard, many variations of the story block appeared over the course of even just like a few months of me being at BuzzFeed. We didn't really account for what would happen to the CSS when we introduced a new variant, especially not like 5 new variants. These are all story blocks, by the way. And like, we definitely didn't know what would happen to the CSS when we did that. So all these different variations that we had to account for were accounted for on top of the original story block CSS. This meant we were constantly overriding that original CSS for that component. Caveat here, I just want to say, like, there are tons of ways we could have solved component modification and component maintenance, and we still definitely, like, we're considering those today, but regardless, it was, like, very clear that we had to move away from this because it was not reducing bloat in any way. So I felt like I was in a very unique position, kind of seeing both sides of the coin. Engineering wanted stability, design wanted flexibility. At the same time, our VP of Design, Kat Watkins, started, who recognized that engineers and designers were not collaborating enough, surprise, and it was starting to affect us. So he presented the problem in this diagram, which if you're from Etsy, you've probably seen. I think he took it from Etsy. I don't know who the original creator is. But basically, we were working like this. Should have been working more like this. But really, we should be working like this. Very simple diagram, right? At the same time, a few of the designers were beginning to play around with base CSS, which Jackson is here. Thank you, Jackson. If you don't know, which you probably do, base CSS is a super flexible and highly adaptable CSS library. And being able to use this in our prototypes inspired us to kind of like think differently about how we were writing CSS, which is awesome. Props to Jackson. And so I think at that time, after we kind of like played around with a different way of writing CSS, we decided we needed to get the designers and the engineers just in a room and start meeting weekly just to talk, if nothing else, and begin like discussing different ways of kind of tackling the CSS, because at this point we had already exposed the problem. I think the key to success here was choosing the right people to be in the conversation. Obviously it was inclusive, so like anyone who wanted to be in the conversation could join, but we specifically knew off the bat that we wanted those engineers that were building the old component library to be in the discussion. So the final negotiation revolved around functional CSS versus a more robust approach, like systemic CSS. I don't know a better way to say this, but basically functional CSS can be described in a few different ways, but it basically revolves around tightly scoped single responsibility classes. So basically, like, I don't know if you guys can read this, but having one class with 3 styles in it, like padding 1.5 rem, text align center, is a little bit more systemic, and then functional would be like breaking every single style out into its own class. Fill yellow, XSP3, which is padding, and XS text center. So just single responsibility classes, super, super different than how we were writing styles. Again, like, the functional styles should be completely immutable and like not easily overwritten like those past classes that I showed. So we finally chose this way of writing, or this way of like starting to work on a pattern library, when it became very clear that the benefits of it kind of outweighed the drawbacks for BuzzFeed's needs specifically. We realized based on our past experience with the component library that we didn't want to commit to a new set of like permanent 100% consistent components. At that time, I think the decision to go with functional CSS, also called atomic CSS, it was definitely still a compromise for our engineering partners who still believed CSS should describe the context rather than what they look like. I don't have enough minutes to go into all of this, but our front-end engineer, Sam Thurman, wrote a really good Medium article about how he learned to stop worrying and love the atomic class. It is literally called How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Atomic Class. It's a great article. So functional CSS for us, changing markup would be less packaged up style. Is that me? Oh, that's me. Cool. Okay. And it also meant performance gain, smaller CSS, which makes engineers happy all the time. So we started really small. We compiled a list of things to define, and then we would assign like one topic a week to 1 or 2 people in that core group, usually 1 engineer, 1 designer. We took a lot of cues from base CSS and other pattern libraries in terms of like where to start. 2 designers, for example, would focus on choosing a typographic system like H1 to H6, while another designer and engineer would focus on a base color palette. To give ourselves the space we needed, instead of trying to rewrite the legacy website while we were deciding on these core styles, we made Solid in a totally separate repo, not affecting the BuzzFeed codebase whatsoever. We also posted the designs in Basecamp, where we document work and spent a lot of time just like road showing the designs around, especially to teams who weren't directly involved. That was kind of like the ultimate way to get buy-in. We wanted everyone to feel like they were getting heard and could at least give their input. So it's like the goal of this was really to touch every product on the site. So a few months into development, we also made the beta public for internally so that teams could use it during Hack Week, which was actually really, it sounds so small and silly, but like that was one of the main things that got engineers like pumped about it. And ultimately, like we got buy-in from many teams because of that like Hack Week beta push. So a year after launching, we've been able to ship a suite of new pages, as well as like iterate on them pretty painlessly. This is our new homepage that we shipped, I think, a little over a month ago. And some wins we've seen over the past year since launching publicly were designers and engineers are coding. Obviously, like we have a common language to talk about UI, which is really helpful. Designers and engineers at a base level, like they're working together, which is totally new for us in terms of like the past year. Like equivalently to designers coding, engineers are in turn kind of like embracing their product instinct and getting more involved with like product and design on the stuff they're working on. The web products are more consistent, yet we have a ton of flexibility because these styles aren't really prescriptive. So I think at its most basic level, Solid is literally only what it needs to be. It's not more than it needs to be right now. I think it allows us to work quickly and consistently alongside a component library. At the same time, we've kind of begun to add some very, very lightweight, like pre-baked CSS-only components where it was necessary. And here we're using like them. We're working very closely with our front-end team to kind of integrate Solid with shared components that we're considering holistically to work like across all apps. So that's sort of where we are now, very early stages of that. Though it was built first and foremost for us, it's open to the public for kind of anyone to download and play with. So if you're interested, you can go take a look yourself. And yeah, that's all I got. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Emily. That was awesome. And now it's me. Hi. So you probably know who I am now. But if you didn't, I'm Diana. I'm a designer at GitHub, and I lead the design systems team there, where I've been working for a year exactly today, funnily enough. Before that, I was at Etsy, so some of the lessons I've learned about working on design systems and style guides has been from working there too, and it's cool that we have a few Etiennes in the audience today. So I decided to talk a little bit less about, there's not too much stuff in like the code here, it's more about some of the lessons I've learned and some of the problems I've had to face working on design systems. So when I joined GitHub in the year 2015, a year ago today, there was a style guide. There was Primer CSS, which some of you may have heard of and seen. And that was kind of it was kind of separated from GitHub. It was pulled in kind of more like a framework. And then within the GitHub app, there was a ton more CSS. The problem, one of the biggest problems was that with all of that CSS, all of that extra CSS, it was not documented. And there were a number of other issues with the actual CSS itself. There were piles and piles of CSS that did the same thing, partly because stuff wasn't documented, so people didn't necessarily know about it. There were many inconsistent styles. There wasn't much of an establishment of systematic approach to the CSS, and there were lots of inconsistent naming conventions. So things like we have boxed group and simple box, they're both boxes, things like that. All of that made it hard to maintain, hard to debug, and also hard to design and prototype with. Like Emily showed, it was like a very slow sort of design to development process, which I also put as a dot point on this slide. Yeah, it was like made it a very lengthy process. Lots of bugs in production and inconsistencies, and that also led to inconsistencies in the user experience. Not that we've overcome all of these issues, but these are the problems that we're trying to work towards to solve. So not long after I started, I was talking with a couple of the design leads and other designers, and it turned out there was a bunch of us interested in trying to solve some of these problems. One of them is Rohan, who's sat right over there, who had been working on Primer for a number of years and wanted to solve some of these problems. There were some marketing designers. In fact, I have a slide that shows us all. So there was, several of us that were seeing these problems and wanting to sort of get together and solve them. So we didn't form really an official team to start off with. We just started off with a meeting to talk about some of the big problems and how could we start to tackle them. So we started with some things that kind of were like the low-hanging fruit, quick wins, things that would make a big impact early on. And so one of the things we did similarly to BuzzFeed was to introduce utility classes or functional classes or atomic classes, whatever you would like to call them. And they're single-purpose classes that do one thing and one thing well. So these are things like background colors, text colors, padding, margin, text sizes, things like that. And what that did is help us start to tackle and reduce this sort of amounts of custom CSS that was in GitHub and build more reusable CSS into Primer, which is our framework. And with this, we started to introduce systems, like a systematic approach to our styles. So the first thing that we started with was a spacing scale, because throughout the app, there were some consistencies, but there wasn't really a way to sort of keep that consistent throughout the product. And so we introduced we initially started off with a 12 base scale, but we upgraded that to a 16 base scale. And the reason that we chose 16 as our scale is because it breaks down and adds up to whole numbers more easily. It's a highly composable number. And we introduced that as variables as well as utilities, so that when we start to update our components, which are kind of like larger patterns, we can keep that scale there, but we can also use them as utilities, the single purpose classes throughout the app. Then we ruined everyone's lives and changed the GitHub font to the system font, and not everyone was very happy with that. But they started to get used to it. But really, the good thing about that for me was that we could start to introduce a typography scale. We kind of like snuck that in while you were all being distracted by the different font face. And we upped our body font size from 13 pixels, yes, 13, to 14, big win. And and the thing that's important with a scale is to, like, we use more like powers of 2 and things that match with that sort of 16 base spacing scale, so that things again matched up, line up more easily. Unfortunately, 14 is a horrible number to work with, but that's the best we could do. At least it was 17.5 when you combine the line height, and not 17.376934, etc. If you want to know more about mathematical web typography, not to embarrass Jackson again, but he wrote a great article on this, which you can read on his website. But yeah, that just helped us again start to introduce like systems, make things more consistent, and yeah, make things like sort of easier to work with. The other thing that was really important was to introduce a clearer, like consistent naming convention. Adam Morse wrote a great article called CSS and Scalability, and I love this quote because it explains it exactly. If you're reading the HTML, you want to know what the CSS is doing. That makes things easier to debug as well. So we have some classes kind of like along the lines of this sort of stuff, where there will be a base style like an alert, and then variations of that style, like alert success. That's the sort of like component classes. And then we have like utilities that just sort of say exactly what they do. Text center makes the text centered, text white turns the text white. And then we try and keep that consistent pattern throughout our class names, so that it's easy. It almost becomes easy to like predict what a class name will be, and it's easier to internalize. There's many different approaches you can take to naming conventions, so you've got to choose like what's right for you. We went with something a little bit different at Etsy to what we have at GitHub. There's different considerations that you might need to take into account in order to choose what's right for you. So another big one, documentation. So as I mentioned, we had the primer site that had the documentation for the primer modules, but we had all this CSS in GitHub that had no documentation. So one of the next steps we did was to move the primer modules into the GitHub app. That kind of meant for the time being, the primer docs were going to go out of date. Sorry, I forgot that slide. That meant that those primer docs were going out of date. And the reason that we did this is because we had some kind of, we created some problems for ourselves by treating primer like an open source CSS framework instead of our framework. It was meaning that we weren't adding stuff to primer unless we thought other people would use it. But really what we needed it to do was to work for us and our company. That doesn't mean that we don't want to make it available to people, but we were treating it like a framework for everyone else and not for ourselves. So moving all the CSS and docs into one place, we then started to create a style guide internally that we could push all of this CSS to and document all the CSS that we wanted to. So yeah, so the main thing is that primer is our CSS framework first, and the style guide documentation is how to use primer. It's everything around that, and tooling and things that help you be able to work, design and develop with our CSS. Something that I learned and took with me from Etsy was defining your principles really early on. So once we got this new documentation set up, one of the first things I did was to work on principles. When I was at Etsy, we talked about our principles. That myself and Aaron and Jessica, who were working on it initially, talked about our principles, but we didn't quite write them down. And so what happened is we were all like kind of taking, I think this is my only gift, by the way, so enjoy it. We were all going away from that same conversation with slightly different impressions of what that really meant. And yeah, it led to some vibrant discussions. And around that time, we actually had Harry Roberts, CSS Wizardry, come in and do a talk about, talk to us about building style guides and front-end development. And he talked about this concept of principle-led development. And it was really funny to me to just go, oh yeah, duh. Like when I do product design work, I often define principles and goals. Why did we all like kind of forget to like write that stuff down for our style guide? And this is one of the reasons why I think there are many reasons why you should treat your style guide like a product. There's many similar comparisons there. So yeah, write down your principles. Do that really early with your team so that you spend less time like disagreeing with each other and more time just working towards those principles. Something that I've felt a few times, and I'm sure anyone else who's been working on building new design systems has felt, it can feel like, oh my God, there is so much stuff to do. Sisyphus, if you look up on Wikipedia, was like confined to like rolling a big rock up a hill and it doesn't go anywhere. And that's sometimes how it can feel like any projects, you need to sort of break things down, and you can. It's really easy to, like, I spent probably was a couple of weeks actually, auditing like every single, not every single, a large amount of our CSS, and making an issue for every single thing that needed to be refactored or updated or had problems with it. And I was like, oh my God, how are we going to get through all this stuff? Because there's always a way to break it down and prioritize and break things into bits. And the other thing that I think is really important is to show and tell. Like when you show people what you've done and they like it, it makes you feel good. So that brings me to another section which I think is really important about working on design systems, which is communication. So around the time I was working on a pull request to introduce responsive styles and a new grid system, it turned into such a huge discussion. I realized we had like some communication problems on our team. And one of the things that I learned, and this is partly to do with also being a remote employee, is that we really need to explain the why behind what you're doing. It's really hard sometimes for people to come to a pull request or however you kind of share what you're working on and know what's happening if they haven't been involved in some of those internal discussions. People will be like, why do I have to write the CSS like this? How is this the way of doing it like this better than the way we were? Is I've had to get really good at trying to break stuff down and explain why we are doing things this way and not another way. The other thing is like we weren't really communicating to the wider like GitHub organization. So one of the things that we started to do is we have like a kind of internal team app is to start to post and share our updates on what we were doing. So that people would know that this new style guide existed, and also it was to let them know that things were changing and know that this stuff was being worked on. It's also really good to include funny pictures and GIFs in these sorts of posts. Rohan is an expert at this. Another form of communication is like when people are actually coming to that documentation. making it really clear and obvious that what the status is and what changes are happening. So we introduced a changelog. I know Solid has one of these on their site. A lot of open source projects will have this sort of thing. And this is a way to just share, like, real quickly what's been added, what's changed, what's been updated, or what's been deleted. Link people to a place where they can see those changes. And it also has started to turn into this really nice history for us on our team to see all the stuff that we've done. So that when we are feeling like we're pushing that big rock up a hill, we can look back at this and see how far we've come. Another thing that we started to do is to make status clear on documentation itself. So we added labels so that people could see what the status of those styles were, and always link to an issue that explains what's happening with that. We also added it to the nav so that when you're quickly scanning through the list of components and utilities, etc., you can see already just from the nav at a glance, like, what the status of something is. This is also an opportunity for us to seek feedback, which is another important thing. So we create a feedback issue every time something is a new release, and we link that to the documentation as well. So while something's in progress, that issue might be more about what's to come and links to the changes in code. Once it's been done, it will act as an issue where we can ask people for feedback. Because just like anything, until people are really using it, you don't know, you haven't really tested it, just like a product. Another key thing about communication is to respond in a timely manner. We were getting, as we started to broadcast that this team existed and that we were working on things, we started to get more and more requests for help and reviews and questions from pull requests and other avenues. And we were having a lot of trouble keeping up with that. And the other thing is that it was largely on other people having to ping us. We weren't very proactive about it. So we introduced a thing which we call first responder. So the core maintainers, which are 3 of us, Rohan's Batman, we each take a week where we are, like, on call, as it were, to keep an eye on what's happening. We have some nifty scripts which Rohan set up where we can just say, hey, what's new? And it will print us out new issues, mentions, so that we can be a lot more proactive. So the minute someone has mentioned us, we can easily see and quickly go and respond to that work. We also track all the CSS and design style guide related issues in issues in a grouped milestone. And these labels have another action for us, because they also pull these issues into what we call a radar for the week. So we set up this automated script that posts an issue in our repo, and it tells us what should be on our radar for that week. It tells us who the first responder is. It tells us about what's a currently active project, and it tells us what needs to review. So this way, less people are waiting around to hear back from us, and we're able to be a lot more proactive. And sometimes communication is just about being available, especially when you're in a new team like we are, and you're kind of changing all these things around people. You're going to need to be there when they have questions and need help with stuff. Over time, people will start to learn how to work with us as well. But it's really important to sort of be available, win favors early on. So what next? There's so many things. Really, I think what we're doing now is, like, working on auditing our components, as well as documenting them. Where we started off with kind of like introducing these utilities, we now need to bring all those systems into our patterns. And so that's, a fair amount of work. That means, like, spending time reviewing all those styles and trying to consolidate them into one component instead of 5, things like that. Also, we're working towards making it public because we feel a little bit bad that the primer docs are kind of out of date. This is a sneak preview. It may change. It probably will change. But yeah, that we still want to, we still share all our CSS. We publish it all on NPM, so it's still available, but the documentation is not available at the moment, and we want to share it. And then I think some hopes for the future. I really want to build a culture of style guide-driven design and development at GitHub. I think it's really important to design with the styles and the style guide first. But there are some problems with that, and I've had some interesting discussions with some other design systems designers about this. The problem is like, where does design happen? Because it doesn't necessarily happen in code first, right? There's, I really love this quote that I saw recently from an article by Kenny D. And I think it's perfect. Design decisions run all the way through a product like molding good cheese. And like, design happens in a lot of places. And when we think about actual products and tools and technology that you use, it could be Figma, Photoshop. What are you doing when you're usability testing? Are you showing them a prototype or what? So there's a lot of problems with like, how do we make how can design systems be in all those places? How can people be thinking, doing style guide driven design right from the early stages? I don't have all the answers to that yet. I have some ideas. If you have the answers, let me know. And yeah, that's what I think the biggest problem that people working on design systems have to solve right now. Thank you.